There are truths that are not buried because they are wrong, but because they lie too far from the center of power to be heard. There are pages of the Bible that were not burned, not cursed, simply forgotten. Like an old man sitting on a street corner, knowing many stories but no longer asked by anyone. This story begins from pages like that, not glossy, not reprinted in millions of copies, but touched by human hands for more than 1,000 years in the dry, rocky highlands of Ethiopia. While the Western world endlessly debates the second coming, who will be taken first? Who will be left behind? With charts, timelines, and theories drawn as neatly as war maps. Somewhere else, far from those theological conference rooms, Ethiopian monks still slowly read ancient words in Ge'ez. They do not rush. They have never rushed. Because to them, prophecy is not meant to win an argument, but to survive a human life. Those manuscripts were here before Europe decided which books were orthodox, before councils gathered to remove texts that made them uncomfortable. They were here when Ethiopia became one of the first Christian nations in the world, not by swords, not by Roman imperial decrees, but through a conversation between two people on a dusty road. One asked, one explained, and faith took root that way. Ethiopia did not build its faith on safety. Its history did not allow that. They did not have centuries of peace to turn prophecy into something abstract and harmless. They lived with war, with siege, with being labeled heretical, peripheral. That is why when they read about the return of the Lord, they do not ask the question the West often asks. They do not ask how to escape. They ask how to stand firm when that day comes. In the Ethiopian Bible, the second coming does not begin with images of people vanishing from the world. It begins with sound, with movement, with the shaking of orders once thought unchangeable. Texts the West calls apocryphal, such as Enoch or Jubilees, are read in Ethiopia as serious warnings, not to spread fear, but to remind that history does not drift without meaning. It is moving toward an appointed meeting. There is something that shocks many people when they first hear of this tradition. The Ethiopian Bible does not have 66 books. It has 81, not because they added, but because they never removed. Books the early church once read, cited, debated, disappeared from the West over time, but remain intact in Ethiopian hands. Not in museum glass cases, but in worship, in prayer, in how they understand justice and hope. This difference is not a technical detail. It reshapes how an entire community sees the future. When the West began to dream of a personal escape, Ethiopia continued to speak of the restoration of creation. When people spoke of going up to heaven, they spoke of heaven coming down to earth. When others focused on souls being saved, they emphasized bodies being raised, land being renewed, justice being carried out within history, not only after history ends. The Ethiopian monasteries, carved deep into stone mountains, were not built to impress. They were built to endure through war, famine, invasion, and oppression. Monks still sat there, copying each word by hand, not because they believed they were guarding a great secret for the world, but because they believed that if these words vanished, a part of truth would vanish with them. They did not call this a global mission, they called it faithfulness. What makes this story uncomfortable for many is not that it is too mystical, but that it is too real. It raises a question the West has grown used to avoiding. Does the way we read prophecy reflect the Bible, or does it reflect our own level of comfort? Do we believe in a returning Lord to change the world, or only to remove us from it? Ethiopia does not answer for anyone. They simply continue to read, continue to live, continue to endure, and in that long silence, a testimony is formed. Not the testimony of those who won history, but of those still standing after history tried to crush them many times. They believe the second coming is not a reward for those who run away, but a vindication for those who do not give up. This story does not begin with a call to action, nor does it end with a conclusion. It begins by opening a door long untouched. And when that door opens, there are no stage lights, only the smell of old paper, cold stone, and a question hanging in the air. If those who have suffered the longest read prophecy this way, do we dare to listen to them? The road where Ethiopian faith began had no markers, no stone tablets. No one stopping to record that history had just turned in another direction. There was only a chariot rolling slowly through the desert, and two people who had not planned to meet. One read aloud, one listened, and a scroll of Isaiah was opened amid sand and hot wind. When Philip asked whether the other understood what he was reading, the answer was not embarrassment, but an invitation. How can I understand if no one guides me? That was not only the question of one individual, but the question of an entire people about to enter a long journey with the Bible. From that moment, Ethiopia did not receive faith as a finished system. They received it as an unfolding story. There was no Roman emperor forcing conversion, no army protecting doctrine. Only words explained, believed, and carried back to another land. While Christianity spread in Europe through power and decrees, Ethiopia continued to grow in silence, wrestling on its own with the text, with questions, with what was not yet clear. Ethiopia's isolation was not a choice, but a circumstance. Mountains, deserts, and unfriendly empires cut them off from major theological centers. Yet that very distance became a strange form of protection. When Western councils debated which books to keep and which to remove, Ethiopia was not in the room. They did not vote, they did not sign, they did not revise, they simply continued to read what they had received. While elsewhere certain texts were labeled dangerous, hard to control, or disruptive to the theological order taking shape. In Ethiopia, those same texts were still read by candlelight, not because they wanted to oppose anyone, but because no one had ever asked them to stop. The Book of Enoch was not seen as a threat. Jubilees was not considered unnecessary. They were simply part of the picture Ethiopia was trying to understand. What matters is that Ethiopia did not keep these books as relics. They did not place them on high shelves and bow in reverence. They brought them into life. Stories of fallen angels, of judgment, of cycles of time did not remain on the margins, but soaked into how they prayed, how they understood justice, and how they endured suffering. For them, prophecy was not meant to entertain the mind, but to keep the spine straight when the world pressed down. As the West gradually formed a theology bound tightly to imperial order, Ethiopia learned how to live with faith without the protection of power. They learned to read scripture without assuming they would always win. And that changed how they looked at the future. The return of the Lord was not imagined as a moment when the strong gained more power, but as the moment when power itself would be questioned. One thing is often overlooked in the story of Ethiopia. They were not only guardians of texts, they were survivors of living by those texts. When Islam expanded, they were surrounded. When European colonial powers arrived, they were seen as backward. When modern ideologies poured in, they were oppressed. Through all those eras, they had no option to soften prophecy for comfort. They read it exactly as it spoke. There would be suffering, there would be trials, but there would be a vindication that could not be reversed. Because of this, Ethiopia never developed a theology that promised believers escape from suffering. They developed a theology that helped people walk through suffering without losing their soul. When they read about the final signs, they did not tremble, they nodded. Not because they were used to pain, but because they knew pain was not the final word. In stone monasteries, where steps have been worn down by the bare feet of generations, The Bible is read like a mirror, not to see a distant future, but to see where one is standing now. Pages written in Ge'ez do not try to please the ear. They are rough, direct, and offer no easy promises. Yet it is precisely that refusal to flatter that makes them trustworthy to those who have lost too much to believe in cheap hope. The story of Ethiopia lays a different foundation for everything that follows. If much of the world is used to reading the second coming through the eyes of the protected, Ethiopia reads it through the eyes of the threatened who were never subdued. From that foundation, differences in prophecy, in justice, in the restoration of the world become clearer. And as the story moves deeper, what becomes clear is not that Ethiopia has answers to everything, but that they have asked questions many others never dared to ask. Questions born not from curiosity, but from survival. From there, their understanding of the return of the Lord slowly takes shape, not as an escape from history, but as a final confrontation with history itself. There is a strange moment when people begin to realize they have grown used to hearing a story in only one way for too long. Not because that story is completely wrong, but because it is told from a place that is too safe. When the eyes are accustomed to protection, they struggle to notice details that only appear in the dark. And it is here that the Ethiopian way of reading prophecy begins to create a quiet but profound collision with the religious imagination of many. In Ethiopian tradition, the return of the Lord is not told in a whisper of comfort, nor in a voice of sensational threat. It is told in the voice of those who have seen the world collapse and then stand again. There is no promise that the righteous will be taken away before things become terrible. There is no image of collective escape. There is only a steady conviction that suffering is not proof of failure and that faithfulness is never wasted. This shifts the entire center of prophecy. Instead of asking when and how to avoid it, Ethiopians ask who will stand firm and what will be renewed. The second coming is no longer an event to flee history, but the moment history is forced to answer, what is built on violence, exploitation, and lies will not endure, not because humans overthrow it, but because truth in the end cannot remain hidden. The Book of Enoch in this tradition is not a book of fear, it is a book of reversed order. Fallen angels, powerful figures, systems that seem untouchable are all placed under the light of being of judgment. Alongside that is a clear image of the righteous, not those protected from all harm, but those not deformed by harm, those who keep their humanity, their faith, and their hope even when pushed into the darkest corner. Perhaps that is why the Ethiopian tradition does not produce many entertaining theories about the end times. They do not need to make the future more dramatic than reality. Their reality has always been harsh enough. What they need is a way of reading that helps them understand that what is happening is not meaningless, that history has direction, and that justice is not delayed forever. Prophecy in that context becomes a rope that keeps the soul from drifting away. When people hear this, some feel uncomfortable, not because Ethiopia says anything extreme, but because they say nothing comfortable. This way of reading does not allow someone to sit safely as a spectator waiting for the final scene. It forces the listener to ask where they stand in the story. Are they building something that will collapse? Or are they enduring and hoping for restoration? If you find yourself thinking more than usual, if questions begin to form that you have never asked before, that is not an accident. Stories like this are not preserved for centuries just to spark curiosity. They are kept because they force people to face their own faith. And if as you listen you wish to leave a thought, a question, or simply continue walking with this journey, that presence itself is already part of the dialogue unfolding across centuries. The Ethiopian tradition does not ask anyone to believe immediately. They do only one patient thing. They place the texts on the table and say, "We lived with these words when nothing was guaranteed. You can read them without fear." There is no pressure, no promotion, only an old invitation. Come and see what faith looks like when it is forged in fire. The deeper one goes, the clearer it becomes that the difference is not that Ethiopia knows more secrets. It is that they do not try to make prophecy harmless. They allow it to keep its weight, to speak of real judgment, real justice, and real renewal in their world. The return of the Lord does not comfort those who benefit from the present, but consoles those crushed by the present. There is a frightening honesty in this way of reading. It does not allow believers to hide behind the safety of the crowd or tradition. It does not allow faith to be separated from life. If God truly will return to renew the world, then the question is no longer where we will be then, but how we have lived before that. And it is here that the narrative begins to move in a direction that cannot be reversed. Once one sees there is another way of reading, a way shaped by endurance rather than convenience, old assumptions begin to shake. What once seemed obvious suddenly needs to be examined again, not to destroy, but to refine. The gaze pages continue to open in the dim light of candles. There is no applause, no audience, only a community accustomed to reading prophecy as if tomorrow they must still go to work, still raise children, still keep faith in an unfriendly world. And from that harsh, ordinary life, another understanding of the second coming slowly takes shape, not as an escape, but as an appointment that cannot be avoided. As the next pages are opened, it becomes clear that the greatest difference is not in the number of books, but in the direction of vision. Ethiopia does not look at prophecy from above looking down, but from the ground looking up, from where bare feet touch cold stone, from where backs bend under heavy loads, from where history never promises ease. Because of this, the return of the Lord in this tradition is not described as a leap away from the earth, but as an earthquake that exposes the true foundations of everything. The Book of Enoch speaks extensively about judgment, but it is not a judgment that is arbitrary or emotional. It is like light shining directly into dark corners that people have grown accustomed to calling normal. The powerful phantoms built on violence and exploitation, lies repeated long enough to become law, all are brought into the light. There is no negotiation, no exception, not because God is cruel, but because justice cannot be established if truth continues to be distorted. In this reading, the righteous are not those who have never been wounded. They are those who have been wounded but did not allow the wounds to define them. They are those who do not let injustice twist their hearts into bitterness. When judgment comes, they are not saved because they avoided suffering, but because they walked through suffering without losing what is essential. This makes prophecy feel very close to life, very real, very difficult to avoid. One point that confuses many in the West is that Ethiopia does not center its hope on the idea of the soul leaving the body to go somewhere else. This tradition speaks deeply about the body, about the land, about creation. They believe resurrection is not the rejection of the material world, but its restoration. Heaven is not a place to escape from earth, but a power that transforms the earth. The return of the Lord, therefore, is the day the world is repaired, not discarded. This perspective is woven into every layer of Ethiopian life. When they look at dry fields, they do not see only a harsh present, but a promise of renewed land. When they look at aging bodies, they do not see something to be thrown away, but something that will be raised again. This anchors their faith tightly to reality, not drifting in lofty ideas. Prophecy does not pull them out of life, but drives them deeper into life with a hope that cannot be extinguished. There is an almost uncompromising honesty in how they read about judgment. No one is exempt simply because they belong to the right religious community. No one is protected simply because they speak the language of faith. Judgment does not target labels, but how people have lived, how they have treated the vulnerable, how they have used power and resources. This is why prophecy in the Ethiopian tradition always carries the breath of social justice, not only personal salvation. In stone monasteries, where walls are so thick that outside sounds cannot enter, monks read passages about the fall of kingdoms and the establishment of the kingdom of God. They do not read with hatred. They read with the calm of those who know that no power is permanent. This creates a distance from the way many are used to reading prophecy as a tool to confirm that their side will win. Here, there are no sides. There is only truth moving forward. Because of this, Ethiopia does not nurture the illusion that history will become gentler as it approaches the end. They believe conflict will intensify, deception will become more refined, and pressure on the faithful will grow heavier. But this belief does not lead them to panic. It leads them to discipline, to building resilient communities, to maintaining steady prayer, to reminding one another that faith is not a passing emotion, but long endurance. In this telling, the second coming is not an ending that shuts down all questions. It is the climax where every question is forced to answer. What humanity has sown in history will bear fruit, unavoidable. Yet alongside that severity is a very concrete hope. That injustice does not have the final word, that those who have been crushed will not be forgotten, that this world, though deeply wounded, is still worth redeeming. The more one reads, the clearer it becomes that Ethiopia does not preserve prophecy to prove itself right. They preserve it so they do not forget who they are in a world that constantly tries to define them by the power of others. Prophecy becomes collective memory, reminding them that history does not belong to those who write textbooks, but to the one who will return to judge with fairness. And as the narrative continues to flow, one thing becomes clear. The difference is not that Ethiopia has more information, but that they allow prophecy to challenge them more deeply. They do not shrink it to fit comfort. They grow themselves to bear its weight. From this posture, their understanding of suffering, justice, and hope begins to spread, not as theory, but as a way of life tested by fire. If there is one thing the Ethiopian tradition has never done, it is separating prophecy from real lived experience. Here, there is no safe distance between what is read and what is happening outside the monastery doors. When they speak of tribulation, it is not an abstract idea. It is collective memory. It is years of siege, generations raised in instability, families learning to pray in silence for fear of being discovered. From this context, the way they understand the return of the Lord carries a very different weight. Ethiopia does not build theology on the assumption that history will be kind to believers. They never had that privilege. Therefore, they do not need a prophecy that promises every hardship will be removed before it becomes too painful. They need a prophecy strong enough to stand with them when pain has already arrived. That is why, in this tradition, endurance is not seen as a failure of faith, but as the environment where faith is proven. When the Book of Enoch speaks of purification, Ethiopia does not understand it as blind punishment. They understand it as a process that separates what is false from what is real. Fire does not only burn, it also reveals. What cannot stand in that light was never truly strong. This makes the second coming a moment of exposure, not merely a moment of ending. No one can carry a mask through that threshold. Throughout history, Ethiopia has often been placed in the weaker position. They understand what it feels like to be pressed down by history without being consulted. So when they read prophecies of reversal, they do not read them as dreams of revenge. They read them as promises of final justice, not to nourish resentment, but to avoid despair. For if injustice were permanent, faithfulness would be meaningless, but if injustice will one day be named, then every small act of the righteous carries meaning. This deeply shapes how Ethiopia views justice. Justice is not pushed entirely into the next world. It begins in how the community lives together, in how they care for the poor, in how they see those pushed to the margins, in how they refuse to equate blessing with power. Prophecy does not allow them to worship a God detached from the cries of the oppressed. The return of the Lord, in this understanding, is the day those cries are publicly answered. There is something deeply uncomfortable for modern thinking when facing this tradition. Ethiopia does not believe one can understand prophecy without allowing it to change how one lives. Here, knowledge is not the destination. It is the beginning of responsibility. If one knows the world will be judged by standards of justice, no one can live as if justice were secondary. If one believes creation will be renewed, no one can despise the body, the land, or other people and still think they are preparing for the future. In the monasteries, prayers are not aimed at escaping the world, but at being faithful within the world. People ask for strength to endure, wisdom to discern, and patience to not lose themselves while waiting. The return of the Lord is not used to justify withdrawal from present responsibility. On the contrary, it makes that responsibility more urgent. This perspective creates a very different rhythm of life. There is no frantic rush to decode every political shift. There is no obsession with fitting every event into a prophetic chart. Ethiopia has lived too long with instability to believe every disruption is the final exclamation point. They understand that history often repeats pain before moving toward healing. What matters is not guessing the moment, but keeping the direction. During periods of oppression, when many other communities collapsed or compromised, Ethiopia preserved continuity not because they were stronger, but because they had a framework that kept them from being shocked when suffering came. Prophecy had already prepared them that faithfulness would carry a cost, and because they had accepted that, the cost did not destroy them, it shaped them. This leads to a deep paradox. Ethiopia, often seen as peripheral, preserves one of the ways of reading prophecy closest to the experience of the early church. A church without political power, without state protection, yet convinced that God was active in history. The return of the Lord for them is not an event that helps believers avoid the world, but an event that prevents the world from continuing to avoid the truth. As the narrative continues to unfold, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The Ethiopian tradition does not offer a spiritual escape for those exhausted by the present. It offers a foundation to stand firm in the present without losing hope for the future. And it is this union of endurance and expectation that creates a depth that cannot be learned in seasons of faith tied to safety. Ethiopians do not claim to understand everything. They do not claim to possess a detailed map of the final days. They only say they have lived long enough with prophecy to know what helps people stand and what merely distracts them. In an increasingly noisy world, where every voice competes to define the future, that steady silence carries a weight that is hard to ignore. And from that very weight, the story continues to lead us deeper, not to uncover more secrets, but to see more clearly a question that has been hanging from the beginning. If the return of the Lord truly means the renewal of all things, then what kind of people are we being invited to become while we wait? Ethiopia's answer is not found in a slogan. It is found in a way of life tested across centuries. The deeper one goes, the more it becomes clear that Ethiopia does not read prophecy like breaking news, but like the long breath of history. Time, in this view, is not a straight line rushing forward to end as quickly as possible. It is cycles, seasons, rhythms of rising and falling that humanity must learn to live with. The Book of Jubilees, with its division of history into 49-year cycles, is not used to calculate exact dates. It is used to remind that God is not absent from that long flow, and that no season ever lies completely outside his hands. In the Ethiopian tradition, recognizing the times is not meant to satisfy curiosity. It is meant to keep the community awake. When they speak of knowledge increasing, people traveling across the earth, voices crossing distances in an instant, they do not marvel at progress. They listen with alertness, because every expansion of human ability also expands the capacity for deception, oppression, and self-exaltation. Prophecy, in this context, does not oppose knowledge. It warns about how knowledge is used. Ethiopia has never viewed technology or power as automatic signs of blessing. They have witnessed too many times how strength is used to crush the weak. So when ancient texts speak of the last days as times of moral confusion, broken families, and distorted religion, they do not see this as a distant curse. They see it as a realistic description of what happens when humanity loses its standards without realizing it is losing them. What stands out is that Ethiopia never limits prophecy to one region or one people. In their reading, the signs do not occur in only one corner of the map. They spread across the earth. This comes from their own experience as a community, always aware that it is part of a wider world, not the center of it. The return of the Lord, therefore, does not revolve around the glory of one nation, but around the judgment of all humanity. When they read Daniel, they do not stop at identifying which beast represents which empire. They focus on what remains constant. Every power raised against justice has an expiration date. Kingdoms rise and fall, leaving ruins and memories. But the kingdom not built by human hands cannot be replaced. This helps Ethiopia avoid placing ultimate hope in any political system. They live in this world, but they do not tie their souls to its promises. A crucial part of this understanding is the acceptance that prophecy has multiple layers of fulfillment. Some things have already been fulfilled, some are unfolding, and some remain ahead. Ethiopia does not force everything to fit perfectly into a single moment. They understand that God's history often runs deeper than human impatience. This allows them to face present upheaval without falling into panic or fanaticism. When wars break out, when disasters strike, when societies shake, Ethiopia does not rush to label these as the final end. They ask a different question. What is this revealing about the human heart, about systems, about what we have built? Prophecy, in this reading, is more like a mirror than a clock. It does not tell how many minutes remain, but it shows the true face of the age. For this reason, the tradition is deeply cautious about turning prophecy into a tool of fear. Fear makes people easy to control. Ethiopia has lived too long under the control of others not to recognize this. They do not believe God needs human panic to fulfill his purposes. They believe what he seeks is faithfulness, alertness, and discernment in a world full of noise. This leads to a very different posture toward the present. Instead of trying to control the future by decoding every sign, Ethiopia focuses on forming people who can stand firm no matter what the future holds. They invest in community, in spiritual discipline, in passing the memory of faith from one generation to the next. For them, this is not delaying the return of the Lord, but preparing rightly for that day. In ancient teachings, Ethiopian teachers often warned that the most dangerous sign of the last days is not war or disaster, but a hardened conscience. When people grow so used to injustice that they no longer recognize it as injustice, when they call evil normal and treat truth lightly, then prophecy has been ignored in the most dangerous way. Because at that point, judgment does not arrive as a surprise, but as an inevitable consequence. This perspective pulls the second coming out of a distant future and shines its light back onto the present. It forces every generation to ask what it is helping to build: a world that can stand in the light, or a world that survives only in darkness. Ethiopia does not answer this for anyone. They simply keep the question alive within communal life. Perhaps this is why the tradition produces fewer sign hunters and more persevering people. People who know history may grow darker before dawn, but also know darkness is not the final chapter. People who do not need to hold the entire map to keep walking, because they trust that the guide never loses the way. As the narrative continues to expand, it becomes clear that Ethiopia does not avoid difficult questions about the age. They simply refuse to answer them with dangerous simplifications. Prophecy, in their hands, does not become an intellectual game, but a foundation for collective wisdom, a wisdom paid for with time, with suffering, and with faithfulness stretched across centuries. And from that foundation, the story gradually leads us to an unavoidable issue. If prophecy truly speaks of global judgment, of justice for the oppressed, of the overturning of unjust orders, then it is not only individuals who are called out. Entire civilizations are brought into the light. And that is where the story touches the places many would rather not feel comfortable. There is a moment in this journey when prophecy is no longer about what will happen, but about what can no longer be allowed to exist. Ethiopia reads apocalyptic texts with a very particular alertness, because they understand that the most frightening thing is not change, but the permission for unjust systems to continue without end. When the texts speak of judgment, they do not imagine blind rage, but a hand restoring order to a world that has been crooked for too long. In this tradition, justice is not an abstract concept debated behind closed doors. It touches land, tables, and human bodies. When prophecy says the powerful will be brought low and the humble lifted up, Ethiopia does not read this as a harmless spiritual metaphor. They read it as a declaration of how God sees the world, a world where value is not measured by power or wealth, but by faithfulness and mercy. This makes the return of the Lord a threat to systems that survive on the silence of victims, not because Ethiopia promotes violence or human-led overthrow, but because they believe no empire stands firm when its foundation is injustice. Prophecy in their hands is not a call to rebellion, but a severe warning. Anything built on the crushing of others is already counting down, no matter how stable it appears on the surface. Because of this, Ethiopia is not easily drawn into political dreams that promise heaven on earth. They have seen too many times how such promises become new tools of oppression. When they read about the kingdom of God, they do not equate it with any existing system. That kingdom does not come from weapons, nor from surface-level reform. It comes from righteous judgment and deep restoration, something no earthly power can manufacture. There is a very delicate balance in this perspective. Ethiopia does not passively wait for miracles, but they also do not believe humanity can save the world through political will alone. They do what they can within their reach, caring for community, protecting the vulnerable, keeping truth alive in word and action. But they do not confuse these efforts with the final completion. The return of the Lord remains the point where all unfinished things are closed, not by human hands, but by justice that cannot be bought. In Ethiopian texts, the image of God is not that of a distant king concerned only with ritual. He is described as the one who hears the cries of the oppressed, remembers every tear, and forgets no injustice even when history has buried it. This gives Ethiopians a very concrete kind of hope. Not the hope that everything will be fine if they stay silent, but the hope that truth will not remain buried forever. Perhaps this is why the tradition is especially sensitive to prophecy being used to protect privilege. Ethiopia is deeply wary of turning faith into a shield for the powerful. They are too familiar with power-wearing religious language to justify violence. So when prophecy is read, the question is not who holds the correct doctrine, but who is carrying the weight of this world and who is adding more weight onto others. People are often surprised to see how calmly Ethiopia reads passages about the collapse of kingdoms. There is no malicious joy, no satisfaction, only an acceptance that every structure not built on justice is fragile. This allows them not to despair when power shifts around them, and not to become intoxicated when power temporarily favors them. They have learned to place hope elsewhere. In this context, the second coming is not a day of revenge, but a day when everything is called by its true name. Light does not create darkness, it only reveals it. Ethiopia believes many things will fall not because God hates the world, but because he loves the world too much to let it remain distorted. Justice, in this sense, is not opposed to mercy. It is the deepest form of mercy for those ignored for too long. This understanding places a clear pressure on present life. If justice is at the center of the future, then no one can live as if justice were a side issue in the present. Ethiopia does not allow faith to be separated from social responsibility, but they also do not turn social responsibility into the ultimate salvation. The two are held in a healthy tension, where people do their part without appointing themselves as final judges. There is a quiet maturity in this posture. It does not need loud slogans. It does not need a stage. It lives in small decisions, repeated across generations. The decision not to betray the vulnerable in exchange for safety. The decision not to remain silent when truth is distorted. The decision to keep the heart soft in a world that teaches people to harden themselves in order to survive. From the outside, many may think this reading is too heavy, too severe, but for Ethiopia, that severity is what keeps hope from becoming illusion. Their hope does not rest on things becoming easier, but on truth prevailing. And in a world where truth is often buried by power, that is not a small hope. The deeper one goes, the clearer it becomes that this story is no longer only about Ethiopia. It begins to reflect back on communities accustomed to safety. It raises a deeply uncomfortable but necessary question. If the return of the Lord truly is the day justice is established, then is our faith preparing us for justice, or teaching us how to avoid it? That question does not require a rushed answer. It requires time, honesty, and perhaps a willingness to change. And from this very point, the narrative begins to touch another issue, no less sensitive. Not only how Ethiopia reads prophecy, but why such ways of reading have been pushed to the margins for centuries. This story is not only theology, it is history, power, and what people choose to listen to or ignore. Once these things are brought into the light, many will find it impossible to keep reading the Bible in the old way without asking new questions. There are stories that do not disappear because they lack evidence, but because they do not serve the story those in power want to tell. As light begins to shine on the journey of the Ethiopian Bible, an unavoidable question slowly appears. If these texts are ancient, if they were known to the early church, if they helped a community survive centuries of persecution, then why were they pushed to the margins for so long? The answer does not lie fully in theology. It lies in the history of power. When European missionaries arrived in Ethiopia in the 15th and 16th centuries, they did not come as learners. They came as people convinced they already had the answers. They could not believe that a black community, living outside the Roman orbit, might preserve a faith older than the stone churches of Europe. That idea was too difficult to accept for a world accustomed to equating truth with its own centers of power. Instead of asking what Ethiopia had preserved, the West asked why Ethiopia had not changed. Instead of listening, they tried to correct. The Ethiopian Bible was seen as disordered, excessive, even dangerous, not because its content clearly contradicted the gospel, but because it did not fit the standardized system. And in history, what does not fit is often pushed aside before it is understood. When a complete copy of the Book of Enoch was brought from Ethiopia to Europe in the 18th century, the first reaction was not curiosity, but suspicion. Western scholars could not believe that monks living on Rocky Mountains had preserved what European libraries had lost. The idea that knowledge could survive outside prestigious universities was too great a challenge to the academic pride of that era. It took many decades, even generations, for researchers to begin admitting that the Ge'ez manuscripts were not late inventions, but windows into a very early tradition. When fragments from Qumran were discovered, when ancient Jewish texts were compared, an uncomfortable truth slowly emerged. Ethiopia did not add, they preserved. Not everything was perfect, but in many places they were closer to the source than the West had assumed. That recognition did not come in a moment of glory. It came slowly, in academic papers few people read, in footnotes at the bottom of pages. And even as evidence became clearer, many Western theological traditions were not eager to adjust, because acknowledging the value of Ethiopia was not just adding new data. It required re-examining how the canon was formed and the role of politics and culture in shaping faith. There is a bitter paradox here. The Western Reformation claimed a return to Scripture, breaking away from papal power. Yet it did so with a narrowed canon, missing texts that a Christian community never subject to Rome had preserved for more than a millennium. Ethiopia, considered peripheral, held a tradition untouched by the internal power struggles of Europe. This does not mean Ethiopia made no mistakes, or that every interpretation was perfect. They themselves never claimed that, but ignoring them for centuries did not come from careful theological discernment. It came from an unspoken assumption that truth must travel a certain path, speak in a certain voice, and carry a certain skin color. The consequences of that neglect were not only academic loss. It shaped how the West read prophecy. When texts emphasizing justice, transformation of the world, and divine intervention in history to restore broken order were sidelined, theology slowly leaned toward personal salvation and escape, not because Scripture clearly taught this alone, but because the parts that disturbed comfort were no longer central. Ethiopia, by preserving those texts, also preserved an uncomfortable question. If God truly will return to judge the nations, then faith cannot remain private. If his kingdom will replace unjust kingdoms, then no system is exempt from the light. These questions are not easy to live with, especially for communities accustomed to faith, walking alongside power and safety. Perhaps that is why only when the world begins to shake, when what once seemed stable starts to crack, do voices from places long considered peripheral begin to be heard. When faith is no longer protected by the majority, when power no longer stands with the church, communities used to living on the margins suddenly become noticeable, not because they offer comforting answers, but because they carry survival experience. In Ethiopian monasteries, there is no surprise at being overlooked. They are accustomed to it. What keeps them copying, teaching, is not hope for recognition, but conviction that the word entrusted to them must be kept faithfully. They did not write for the West. They wrote for their children, for generations who would need these words when the world grows harsher. That persistence challenges anyone who approaches this story seriously. Not a challenge to choose sides, but a challenge to re-examine how our beliefs were formed. How many things do we assume are obvious simply because we never heard another voice? How much of Scripture has been read through the lens of safety rather than the cross? The story of Ethiopia does not ask anyone to abandon their tradition. It asks only for humility enough to admit that the church never had a single center. Faith has been kept alive in many places through many voices under very different conditions. And sometimes the least heard voices carry parts of the story others have dropped. As the narrative moves forward, it becomes clear that the issue is no longer only which texts were kept or lost. It is the question of who gets to define what is central and what is peripheral. When that question is raised, not only theological history is illuminated, but the present also reveals cracks we have grown used to ignoring. What Ethiopia preserved is not a weapon for debate. It is a living memory, paid for with time and suffering. When that memory begins to be shared, it does not bring accusation, but a reminder that faith does not belong to the strongest, nor to the loudest. It belongs to those who kept it alive when there was nothing else to hold on to. And from this point, the story cannot stop at criticizing the past. It must turn toward the present. If voices once ignored are carrying insights needed for this moment, then the question is no longer who was wrong. The question is what we will do with what is being placed before us now. When the light has shone deep enough into history, the story no longer allows the listener to remain on the outside as a neutral observer. Ethiopia does not tell these things to restore its honor in the eyes of Western scholarship. They tell them because they believe there are moments in history when what was once ignored becomes essential for survival, and they sense very clearly that the world is entering such a moment. Ethiopia is not surprised by the widespread anxiety spreading through modern societies. They have lived with it for a long time. When structures once thought stable begin to shake, when faith in progress is no longer enough to comfort people, they do not panic in search of new explanations. They return to the texts that have walked with them for centuries. Texts read in times of war, famine, and existential threat. And what they find is not an escape plan, but direction for faithfulness. In the Ethiopian tradition, the signs of the times are not understood as signals to withdraw from shared life. On the contrary, they highlight the need for deeper commitment to community. When pressure increases, isolated individuals become fragile. Ethiopia understands this well, so they do not prepare for the future by storing secret knowledge, but by strengthening bonds between people. Faith in this understanding is never a solo project. The monasteries carved into stone mountains are not only places where books are kept, they are spaces where people are formed. There, one learns how to live slowly, how to distinguish what is essential from what distracts, how to pray when nothing changes immediately. In those rhythms that seem monotonous, spiritual endurance is shaped. That endurance keeps them from breaking when the promises of the world lose their weight. Ethiopia reads passages about tribulation in Revelation or in the teachings of Jesus not as scripts reserved for one final generation. They read them as honest descriptions of the church's experience in a world often opposed to truth. This frees them from the obsession of identifying which chapter of history they are living in. Instead, they focus on the one question that always matters: how to be faithful in the present circumstance. This way of reading creates a clear difference in how crises are faced. While many communities fall into extremes, either denying reality to preserve a sense of safety or exaggerating reality to stir panic, Ethiopia keeps a different rhythm. They name what is happening truthfully, but they do not let fear lead their actions. Prophecy is not used to inflame, but to keep conscience awake. One of the deepest insights of this tradition is how it understands victory. Victory is not avoiding suffering, but refusing to let suffering shape a person into something they do not wish to become. Ethiopia has seen many communities lose their soul in exchange for short-term survival, so they understand that some losses are worse than death. Prophecy, in this context, becomes a reminder that there are values that cannot be negotiated, even when the cost is high. When speaking of the return of Christ, Ethiopia does not focus on dramatic spectacle. They focus on the character that such an event demands. If the one who will return is righteous, then those who wait for him cannot live in compromise with injustice. If he will judge deception, then living in truth cannot be postponed. Waiting in this tradition is not passive. It is a way of life with clear direction. This presents a major challenge for communities accustomed to faith being protected by majority status or political power. When those layers of protection thin, the question is no longer how to maintain influence, but how to remain faithful. Ethiopia has no quick formula. They only have a long history showing that faithfulness, though it may not bring immediate safety, creates long-term survival. In ancient texts, the image of a multitude from every nation coming out of tribulation is not understood as a miracle that removes people from suffering, but as proof that suffering does not get to choose who will remain faithful. Ethiopia sees itself in that multitude, not as a special victim, but as part of a global community learning to hold faith in very different circumstances. This understanding opens a wide vision of the church, no longer a story of one single center, but of many small communities, scattered, sometimes fragile, yet connected by the same hope. Ethiopia, with its long experience on the margins, has no difficulty imagining such a church. They have lived that reality long before it became a vision for others. There is something striking when listening to Ethiopian monks speak about the future. They do not speak with bitterness, nor with triumph. They speak with the calm of those who have learned how to wait without letting go. For them, the world becoming harder to live in is not a sign of failure, but a reminder that faith was never promised to be easy. What was promised is the presence of God, even in the harshest conditions. At this point, the story begins to turn back toward the listener, not to accuse, but to invite reflection. If Ethiopia has preserved faith for centuries without promises of escape, then what is sustaining our faith today? If prophecy truly prepares people for difficult times, are we using it to prepare or to avoid? These questions have no quick answers. Ethiopia does not offer ready-made conclusions. They simply place before the world a living testimony. A community that has learned to read prophecy not as an escape, but as a narrow path, where each step requires faithfulness. And on that path, they believe the one who will return walks with them, not at the end as a reward, but in every step as strength. As the story approaches its conclusion, one thing becomes undeniable. What Ethiopia preserves is not a heritage to admire from a distance. It is an invitation into a way of life that does not promise safety, but promises meaning, that does not promise avoidance of tribulation, but promises that tribulation will not have the final word. And from this very point, the story moves into its final part, not to close every question, but to place before us a very real choice. The choice between treating these ancient voices as something distant, or allowing them to challenge how we understand, how we wait, and how we live our faith today. The stone walls of Ethiopian monasteries were never built to impress. They were built to endure across centuries. Stone has been worn by wind, by sun, by hands touching it in prayer filled with fear and hope. If those walls could speak, they would not tell of glorious victories, but of quiet faithfulness. And from that faithfulness, this story reaches an unavoidable point. It is no longer only Ethiopia's story. but the story of anyone trying to understand how to live when the future becomes fragile. Ethiopia has never claimed that its tradition is the final answer to every question. They do not place themselves above anyone. What they do, simple yet demanding, is keep what they have received. Keep the books. Keep the memory. Keep a way of reading prophecy that is not softened to fit comfort. In a world always trying to dull what is uncomfortable, Ethiopia preserves the weight of both promise and warning, refusing to separate the two. When they speak of the return of the Lord, they do not speak as people waiting for an event to remove them from the world. They speak as people who believe this world matters enough for God to return and restore it. That changes everything. It reshapes how they see history, how they see suffering, how they see responsibility. If the world will be renewed, then it is worth loving, worth protecting, worth living faithfully in, even when it gives nothing back. There is a clear maturity in how they wait. No panic, no delay. They live as if the return of the Lord could happen at any moment, and also as if they must raise children, hold communities together, and protect faith for many generations to come. These two ways of living do not contradict each other. They complete each other. Waiting in this tradition is not staring at the sky. It is working, loving, and enduring with the awareness that everything is seen. What makes the Ethiopian story remarkable is not that they guessed the timing correctly, but that they did not need to guess in order to live rightly. They did not build their faith on certainty about the future, but on certainty about the one who holds the future. When systems collapse, when power changes hands, when human promises lose their value, they do not need to redraw the map. They have learned how to walk by faith through the fog. This places a direct question before the world today. If our faith was formed during years of stability, how will it stand when stability is gone? If the prophecy we are used to hearing mainly helps us feel safe, what will it offer when safety disappears? Ethiopia does not ask these questions to shame anyone. They ask because they have paid the price of not asking them early enough. In their tradition, prophecy is always tied to preparation, not excitement. Preparation to avoid deception, preparation to preserve mercy, preparation to refuse trading truth for temporary survival. The return of the Lord, therefore, is not only a future point, but a standard that shines backward into the present, forcing every generation to ask what it is building. Ethiopia has lived through seasons when faith brought no social advantage, opened no doors, guaranteed no safety. In those seasons, the only thing left was a simple but painful question: do I still believe when there is nothing to gain? In such moments, prophecy stops being a topic of debate. It becomes oxygen, not because it makes life easier, but because it makes life meaningful. This story does not call anyone to abandon their tradition. It does not demand replacement. It invites expansion. Expansion of space to listen to voices tested by fire. Expansion of humility to admit the church is larger than what feels familiar. Expansion of honesty to face how many readings of prophecy have been shaped more by comfort than by the cross. Ethiopian monks did not copy manuscripts in hopes of future recognition. They copied because they believed there would be generations who would need these words when the world became less predictable. They believed there would be times when avoidance would no longer be an option, and only faith refined by truth would be strong enough to stand. If that time is drawing near, then what they preserved is no longer marginal. What remains, after all analysis and comparison, is not a new doctrine, but a very old invitation, an invitation to be faithful when there is no reward, an invitation to love justice when it costs something, an invitation to wait not by escaping, but by engaging. Ethiopia does not say this path is easy. They simply show that this path can be walked. Looking back over the entire journey, what lingers is not amazement at ancient texts, but awakening to a present question. If the return of the Lord truly is the day when truth is revealed and justice is established, then what in our lives today could stand in that light? What materials are we building with? And what are we waiting for? The stone walls of Ethiopia still stand, not because they are unbreakable, but because they rest on the right foundation. Their faith is the same, not perfect, not without flaw, but strong enough not to be swept away when storms come. In a world learning again how to live with uncertainty, that testimony may not be the answer for everyone, but it can be a mirror for many. The story closes here, not like a door shutting, but like a pause to ask how we read prophecy, how we wait, and what we use to live our faith. Ethiopia preserved these words across centuries not to shock, but to remind us that real hope does not need to shout. It only needs to endure long enough not to go out when the night grows long.
Grateful that you chose to spend these moments in the light of this story. If it touched your soul, please like, share, and subscribe, and ring the bell so the next whisper of light may find its way back to you.